right, I'm going to get us kicked off here. So firstly, thank you so much for all of you joining us tonight. I'm here in New York City, a nice and cool night, but looking forward to getting some nice love from our two fantastic doctors who are going to talk to us about hearts during this month of hearts, Valentine's Day. For those of you that joined a little bit late, if you wouldn't mind just putting your name, your school, and your graduating years in your name, that helps us get to know each other a bit better. We'll also be having a little kind of fun sidebar chat, let people know where you're from, and that will go on to help further build our community. But also want to let you know, as we start to get a little bit more serious and our doctors are presenting, please put your professional questions for the doctors in the Q&A. That's a section where only the panelists see the questions, and it's just a little bit more private. That way you can be comfortable asking the questions that are important to you without infringing on your privacy. All right, enough of the housekeeping. Let's get ourselves started here. So for those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of getting to know, my name is Aruna Inalsingh. I'm Fuqua 95. I'm honored to be the co-chair of DAAA. We're a sponsor of this webinar, and our affinity group has only been around for 2 years. And our goal is really to engage the Asian and Asian American community through unique programming and some good networking, building new relationships and also reconnecting with relationships that we might not have had for a little while. We are lucky our board is currently about 15-ish alumni members. And as part of our board, one of our co-chairs in the Duke Triangle area is Rajesh Swaminathan. Raj has been a very good representative as an interventional cardiologist at Duke. Has been asked all sorts of questions about heart health, especially in the Asian American, and South Asian community. And he thought that this was a great month for us to hold a webinar where we would learn a little bit more about cardiovascular disease. And he's brought in a wonderful colleague and also terrific alumni also from Duke, who is an expert in prevention of cardiovascular disease. I'm going to have Raj introduce Neha, our guest speaker this evening, but not before just letting you guys know that you are in really some pretty impressive company. Raj is currently also working at Durham VA Medical Center. He did some work at Mass Gen. He was a Harvard MIT fellow, also did work at Cornell. And the list is long and impressive. Equally impressive to Dr. Neha, who you guys are going to meet soon here. Raj and Neha got to meet each other when Raj came back to North Carolina in 2016. And he and Neha and their families became fast friends. And that's how we ended up with both of them today. So with that, Raj, why don't I kick this off to you so everybody can get to see your smiling face, and you can also do a lovely intro of Dr. Neha for us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Aruna. Let me see if I can get my video on it. Kathy, I wonder if we can enable my video. There we go. Awesome, folks. Okay, thanks, Aruna. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on how to keep your heart healthy with a focus on heart disease and diabetes in South Asians. Thank you so much for registering and showing interest. You know, when I first proposed this webinar, I didn't realize that we were going to have so many participants. But I think it just speaks to how important this topic is, and we're very excited to be doing this. The mission of DAAA is really to unify the Asian and South Asian American community, basically by giving a lot of opportunities for social, personal, and professional development. So our national chairs, board members, and through regional support, we've really been able to do that through very meaningful programming, much like the webinar that we have planned this evening. So I wanted to just give a little bit of context before we get started with our wonderful speaker. We intentionally chose to hold this webinar in February because, as many of you know, February is National Heart Health Awareness Month. And now as a practicing cardiologist for me, and every month is really Heart Awareness Month. But I hope after this webinar that you'll also see it as such and make heart health a part of your daily routine. So now, heart disease remains the leading cause of death worldwide. About 1 in every 4 deaths is attributed to heart disease. And another concerning fact that I saw from the CDC is that 1 person dies every 36 seconds in the United States from cardiovascular disease. So, if you think about that, that means that over the course of this 1-hour webinar, there will sadly be about 100 deaths from heart disease. And this number is likely higher in people of South Asian descent, where recent studies have shown a 3- to 4-fold increase in the risk of heart disease compared with the general population. So for that reason, we've decided to focus on the South Asian community, which typically includes those from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and the Maldives. But of course, many of the discussion points and recommendations that we're going to be talking about will be broadly applicable to all people. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Neha Pagidipati. I think many of our patients call her Dr. P, is a good friend and colleague of mine here at Duke in the Division of Cardiology. She's an assistant professor of medicine and the director of the Duke Cardiometabolic Prevention Clinic. She holds many hats at Duke. She also serves as the associate program director for our clinical and research fellowship program. So she's deeply involved in the recruiting and mentoring of our trainees and the next generation of cardiologists. Neha graduated from Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health. She completed her internal medicine residency training at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, followed by a fellowship in global women's health before coming to Duke in 2013 to complete her cardiology fellowship. So she joined the faculty here in 2017. So clearly, Neha, you have fulfilled every South Asian parent's dream with that pedigree. And we are really looking forward to not only hearing your talk, but we're going to have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A directly from our audience right after. So please start submitting your questions in the Q&A box. And with that, Neha, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, Raj, thank you so much. And first of all, Raj, thank you for inviting me. I think this is a huge honor for me to be able to speak to this wonderful community of the Duke, Asian community. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk about the thing that, that really motivates me and that excites me. And that's how we prevent heart disease, especially in those that are at high risk of developing heart disease. So as Raj mentioned, my focus is on cardiometabolic disease prevention. That's what I do clinically. I help to run the cardiometabolic prevention program here. And then I also do a lot of research and prevention work, especially around lipid disorders, obesity, diabetes, and so forth. My goal tonight is to kind of give an overview around heart disease and diabetes risk, especially in South Asians. But my goal is to keep it relatively brief so that I can try as best I can to answer whatever questions you have. And when I don't know the answer, undoubtedly, Raj will. So I think we'll hopefully have things covered. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And I hope that you all can see it. Hopefully someone will tell me if you can't. Again, the focus today is going to be on how we keep our hearts healthy, especially in the South Asian community. And these are my disclosures, just so that you're aware they shouldn't impact the content of the talk today. So as Raj mentioned, we know that South Asians are at an increased risk for heart disease. There has been this incredibly rapid epidemiologic shift from communicable to non-communicable diseases causing deaths in Asia, and specifically in South Asia, such that, when we think about the years of life that are lost due to heart disease in India, specifically, for example, that has increased dramatically just in the last few decades. So between 1990 and 2010, there's been an increase by 59% of years of life lost due to heart disease. So this transition has happened extremely quickly in South Asia, whereas it happened over really hundreds of years in Western nations. And unfortunately, this is also leading to a large proportion of heart disease and cardiac deaths happening at very young ages in South Asians. So whereas only 23% of people in Western populations die of heart death before the age of 70, that's over half in India. Over half of the cardiac deaths that happen in India happen before the age of 70. And what you can see here is there are data here from India for both women and men. And you can see that the rates of cardiovascular disease, CVD means cardiovascular disease, mortality is much higher in India than it is in the US or than it is in other high-income countries. And it's particularly high among men in some of these specific cities which have good tracking of death indicators. But it's not just South Asians in South Asia that are at high risk. It's also South Asians in America. So we know that South Asians in America are also at increased risk for developing heart disease. And these are data basically that are telling us the proportion of deaths that occur in a given population that are due to heart disease. And what you can see here, the blue line are the Asian Indians, the yellow line are the white population, and you can see other types of Asians, not just South Asians, but also East Asians in the other colors. And for all cardiovascular disease, the highest proportion is for Asian Indians. We're very closely behind our whites, but also Filipino populations, and less so for the more Eastern Asian populations. But then when we look at cerebrovascular disease, still Asian Indians have the highest proportional rate along with Filipinos, but you also see that some of the other Eastern Asian populations are starting to have higher rates as well, higher than the white populations for cerebrovascular disease. And by that, I mean stroke. So what is going on here? We know that South Asians develop, as I mentioned, heart disease at younger ages than many other populations. And what we have found is that the average age for a first heart attack in a South Asian is about 53 years old, whereas it's 59 years old in other countries. Now, these data come from a really interesting study called the Interheart Study. And this evaluated patients who had a heart attack across 52 countries. And they matched individuals who had a heart attack to individuals who didn't. And they looked for comparisons between them. And this analysis specifically looked at 5 South Asian countries, in particular, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. And then they compared them to other countries. And what really came out very strongly was the idea that the same risk factors that are leading to heart disease in other parts of the world, they're the same risk factors that are causing heart disease in South Asia, but the difference is those risk factors are present at high levels at much younger ages. So again, it's the same basic risk factors, the same things that are putting people at risk of developing heart disease at a young age in comparison with Western populations, but it's just that people have a higher burden of these risk factors at younger ages in South Asia. And here you can see what those 9 major risk factors are, and I'm going to go through many of them individually over the next several slides. So first we'll start with diabetes. And here is probably where we have the largest risk factor disparity, because South Asians are twice as likely to have diabetes compared with white individuals. And these are data from the Masala Study. You may not be familiar with the Masala Study. I am not a part of it, so I can brag about it because I think it is the coolest thing. It is a National Institute of Health funded study, a national cohort of South Asians that are followed multi-generationally. So they're following many generations of South Asians over decades to be able to understand the prevalence and the incidence of heart disease and stroke. And thus far, the Masala Study has really started in San Francisco, and there are approximately 900 South Asians who are enrolled in the study in San Francisco, and there are additional sites coming up in other parts of the country, like in Chicago and other places. But what the Masala Study has shown us, and you'll see a lot of data in this talk from the Masala Study, it's that there is a very high prevalence of diabetes in South Asians. So whereas in the Masala Study, there was 23% of individuals with had diabetes who were South Asian, there are much lower rates in the other races and ethnicities, as you can see here. So the rates of diabetes are extremely high in South Asians. And why is that? Well, we don't entirely know, but there are lots of studies that can shed some light on this. And what we do know is that some of the traditional risk factors, the things that we often associate with developing diabetes, obesity, exercise, blood pressure, et cetera, they may not entirely account for these huge differences that we see between South Asians and other populations. There are some data to suggest that South Asians may have lower beta cell function. The beta cell is basically the cell within the pancreas that creates insulin. And so it may be that South Asians just don't produce insulin in the same way and have higher insulin resistance than other populations. But there are other things also. There is a higher proportion, a higher prevalence of what we call visceral adiposity. Visceral adiposity is basically, in contrast with the subcutaneous fat that we're all familiar with, visceral adiposity or visceral fat is basically the fat that is surrounding the abdominal organs, kind of deep within us. And it's bad. It's not a good thing to have a lot of visceral adiposity because they're very hormonally active and they actually worsen insulin resistance. And so there is a thought that South Asians who have a higher visceral adiposity, that could be contributing to the diabetes. And this may get to this concept called the thrifty phenotype hypothesis. And I'm going to come back to this in a couple of minutes. But there's this hypothesis that back when we were all cavemen, the genes that were selected for were the genes that were really helpful during famine and starvation, where you could store all of your energy as fat and hang on to it so that when there was no food around, you would be able to survive. Now that we have passed the famine and the starvation era, those genes are still present. They've still been selected for. And so we're storing all of the fat, even though it's no longer beneficial to us. So that may be part of the reason that we have this higher visceral adiposity in the South Asian population. In addition, we know that there are lower rates of fitness, cardiorespiratory fitness. We'll come back to some of that as well. There are also higher rates of gestational diabetes among women. And we know that diabetes that develops during pregnancy, called gestational diabetes, is a risk factor for developing diabetes later in life. And South Asian women seem to have a higher risk of developing gestational diabetes, which then subsequently puts them at a higher risk for developing diabetes later in life. There are also some cultural practices, again, from the Masala study. We found that individuals found that serving Indian sweets and an arranged marriage were actually associated with a higher carbohydrate consumption and a higher rate of diabetes. And finally, there is a social stigma that many people have studied around diabetes, and there are also a lot of fears around drug toxicity that leads there to be some kind of difficulty with medication adherence in some people within the South Asian population. I'll talk briefly about what's called the South Asian phenotype, or the thin fat Indians, which is not necessarily the most flattering term, but it is something that is out there in the literature. And it's this concept that South Asians have higher rates of cardiometabolic abnormalities at lower or considered normal BMIs. So for a given individual at a certain BMI, if you take, for example, a white population, the proportion of people who will have kind of blood pressure issues, cholesterol issues, sugar issues will be pretty high at higher levels of BMI and lower at lower levels of BMI, because it seems to be associated with the obesity that BMI represents. But that's not the case with South Asians. With South Asians, we tend to have higher rates of cholesterol issues, blood pressure issues, sugar issues, even at lower levels of BMI. And that, as I mentioned here, includes high blood glucose, high triglycerides, low HDL or good cholesterol, the abdominal adiposity, that kind of mainly putting on the weight around the midsection, and then high C-reactive protein. And C-reactive protein is an inflammatory marker. And there's evidence to suggest that there are higher rates of inflammation, which can contribute to cardiovascular disease in South Asians. So as we just briefly discussed in terms of obesity, the body mass index may not be the best metric for capture of obesity in South Asian populations, because it really doesn't adequately capture the abdominal obesity, which is where a lot of the adiposity occurs in South Asians. So there has been a movement, and you can see here there's actually a website called screenat23.org. It's really a movement to try and increase awareness of the risk that South Asians have of diabetes and other cardiac issues at lower BMIs, lower than what would be considered risky for other populations. And so whereas Overweight in a white population is around 25, and obesity is considered at a BMI of 30. There's a movement to screen people for prediabetes and diabetes and other cardiometabolic issues at 23 if they are South Asian. So if your body mass index, which is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared, is greater than 23, then it's something where you should probably be talking to your doctor about just making sure that you're getting screened, that your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your sugars and all are okay. It's also been shown in several studies that the BMI might not be the best way to assess obesity in South Asians, but waist to hip ratio or waist circumference are better. And so waist circumference also has kind of like specific cutoffs within South Asians, and that's less than 90 centimeters in men and less than 80 centimeters in women. And in waist circumference, you're really basically taking a tape measure and measuring around just above your hip bones, probably just below your belly button. You measure around and you see, and that's essentially your waist circumference, and it tends to be a better indicator of obesity in South Asians than the BMI. And then again, we also can't forget that this idea that it's not just the subcutaneous fat that we can see and that we can measure easily, there's also the higher visceral adiposity that we need to be aware of. I'll talk briefly about cholesterol. And so cholesterol clearly, no matter what population we're looking at, is a very strong predictor and risk factor for heart disease. And what we know is that South Asians tend to have the following kind of types of cholesterol issues, which increases the risk for heart disease. So South Asians tend to have a low HDL cholesterol, which is the quote unquote good cholesterol. They tend to have high triglycerides, and they tend to have lots of little small dense LDL particles. And LDL, or low density lipoproteins, are the bad cholesterol. And it's even worse if you have many of them and they're very small. And so that tends to be the more common phenotype that goes along with the South Asian phenotype that we discussed, that's present in more South Asians. We don't entirely know why this is, but it's very clearly related to insulin resistance. So the fact that South Asians tend to have higher levels of insulin resistance probably contribute to this kind of phenotype of cholesterol abnormalities that we tend to see in South Asians. Similarly, blood pressure tends to be worse, and it's even worse in immigrants from South Asia than in native South Asians, so it probably has a lot to do with kind of westernization of diet and lifestyle. But the Masala study has also shown us that there's a very high prevalence of hypertension in the US community of South Asians. In their population, 43% of men and 35% of women had hypertension, and that's clearly been clearly worsened by high salt intake in the diet. And we can talk more about this, but really the goal for most people should be to have a systolic blood pressure less than 130 and a diastolic blood pressure of less than 80, unless you're very elderly or have some other reasons to have a slightly higher goal. I'll talk a little bit about diet, and I'm sure we'll get more to this in the question and answer. But diet is obviously a very important part of South Asian culture, and it's also a very important piece of the high rates of heart disease and diabetes that we're seeing in this population. So again, from the Masala study, there was an analysis done to try and understand the different types of diets that people had. And what they did basically was identify that there are kind of three general types or clusters of diet that their South Asian populations generally adhere to. One was the animal protein diet, as depicted by my pictures of fried chicken and so forth. Fried chicken actually specifically was a very high part of this, large part of this animal protein diet. The second kind of type of diet that was pretty common was the diet that was largely vegetarian, but was high in intake of fried snacks, sweets, and high-fat dairy. And then the last or third type of main diet was also vegetarian, but it was really high in consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes or dals. And what they found when they compared the different kind of metrics, the different blood pressure, sugars, cholesterol, and so forth in these different groups was probably what you'd expect. The animal protein group had a higher waist circumference, so obesity was higher in that group. In the second group, the fried snacks, sweets, and high-fat dairy, there was higher levels of insulin resistance, which can contribute to diabetes. There was also lower HDL or lower good cholesterol, so neither of those things are good. But in the group of people that ate fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes, there was lower blood pressure and less metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome can often be thought of as kind of like a precursor to diabetes. It basically is a cluster of risk factors that that are not great for you. It includes high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, high waist circumference, and abnormal sugars or insulin resistance. So I think one of the things I took away from this that's important is that just because somebody's vegetarian doesn't necessarily mean that they have a healthy diet, right? There's vegetarian and there's vegetarian. There's the kind of vegetarian that eats mostly samosas and jalebis, and then there's a kind of vegetarian that eats like dal, nuts, and fruit, and they're not necessarily equal. In terms of physical activity, we know clearly that exercise decreases the rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, anxiety, obesity, dementia. I mean, basically, it does everything. Exercise is one of the most important therapies that we have to prevent disease and illness as we age. But in one of the cohorts that I read, only 52% of South Asians met the recommended guidelines for physical activity. Now, why is that? Well, there was another study that showed about half of South Asians thought that exercise was important for prevention of heart disease, which means the other half didn't think that exercise was important for the prevention of heart disease. There was another study in Canada that showed that South Asians had kind of a lower perception of the convenience of the physical activity, opportunities that they had around them, that they thought that there weren't, enough safe and convenient facilities to do physical activity, even though they tended to live in kind of the wealthier neighborhoods. And there have also been several studies that have been more qualitative that have looked at, aspects of acculturation, of how people kind of assimilate from South Asian communities into the US and Canadian cultures. And there's been a lot written about this concept that for some individuals, exercise may be considered as selfish because it's kind of time spent away from family interaction, something that you're doing for yourself. And so it may not be considered kind of a positive thing to do. So these are all really important things. And I think just emphasize to all of us, and especially those of us who treat the South Asian community, that we really need to understand where people are coming from. You can't just say exercise is good and leave it at that. You really need to understand kind of what perceptions and cultural beliefs people are bringing to the table. But at the end of the day, I'm here to say that exercise is good for you. It is necessary. It's important for you. It's important for your family. It's important for everybody. And at least 30 minutes of moderate level aerobic exercise, meaning getting your heart rate up, not just stretching or doing weights, but getting your heart rate up, which is aerobic exercise, doing at least 30 minutes of that 5 days a week is really important. And then I'll touch briefly on genetics, right? Because a lot of people will say, well, it can't just be that we have different risk factors. There's something different about South Asians in terms of their risk for heart disease and diabetes. And that may absolutely be the case, because as we talked before, there may be this concept of the thrifty gene hypothesis that we are still kind of operating on caveman type times, but we no longer live in those stages of famine. And so the things that were previously adaptive and good for us may not be good for us anymore. But in preparing this talk, I spoke with Swati Shah, who's one of probably the world's most forefront geneticists in cardiovascular disease, and she's here at Duke. And I talked to her a little bit about where the state of the field is in terms of understanding the genetics behind the higher rate of heart disease and diabetes in South Asians. And what she says is that, a lot of the genetic studies have just unfortunately not yet been large enough to really understand unique genetic risk factors in South Asians. There have been massive genetic studies done in other populations, in white populations and other populations in the Western world, but very little has been done on that scale. And that scale is necessary, especially if you want to look at gene environment interactions, which are extremely important when we think about the thrifty gene hypothesis. So I would say that the upshot is that, no one knows to what degree genetics contributes to the higher rates of cardiovascular disease and obesity in South Asians. We definitely need more research. But what we do know is that genetic predisposition can largely be overcome by a healthy lifestyle. So we can't be fatalistic about this. Just because people are South Asian doesn't necessarily mean that no matter what they do, they're going to develop heart disease or diabetes. On the contrary, it means we just have to be much more aware and much more conscientious about making sure that people understand what a healthy lifestyle entails. So the key takeaway points that I would hope that you take from this talk, again, South Asians are at risk for heart disease and diabetes, but this risk is largely modifiable. And we should focus on the things that we can change. So working with your doctor to keep your blood pressure, cholesterol and sugars under control, screening at 23. So if your BMI is greater than or equal to 23, you should get screened for diabetes and also cholesterol and blood pressure issues. Eating a healthy diet, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, in the Q&A, but a diet that's relatively low in carbohydrates and high in healthy fats, lean protein, and vegetables. And then exercising every day is also extremely important. And we will put this in the resources tab afterwards, but I do just want to mention that here are some good resources in case people are interested. The American Heart Association put out a scientific statement on the risk of heart disease in South Asians recently. This is the link to it. The Masala Study Health Resources also has a lot of really interesting information around nutrition and diet and exercise, as does the Joslin Diabetes Center Asian American Diabetes Initiative. So I will pause there and stop sharing my screen.
That was wonderful. That was wonderful, Neha. Really fantastic, great overview, hitting on many of the main points and the increased risk of heart disease in the South Asian community. So, I think you really addressed a lot of the questions that some of our audience actually asked during the registration process. And I know there's going to be a lot more questions coming in, so I want to make sure that we get to those. I thought first that we could just have a few discussion points to go over just to get us started, and this will give our audience some more time to get their questions in the Q&A box. Neha, we intentionally focused this webinar on the South Asian community, but I was wondering if you could maybe put this population within the context of other populations in that region, for example, East Asians, and then other regions outside of Asia. For example, are there differences in the rates of diabetes, cholesterol, high blood pressure? Are there differences in the outcomes, heart attacks, strokes, mortality between South Asians and other Asians or other groups?
Yes, so much to talk about there. So let's see what I can say. So yes, there are absolutely variations by region. And actually the CDC has really good information on this. You can see some of the highest rates of heart disease are actually in Russia, where a lot of patients are undertreated and the risks are incredibly high in some of these Eastern European populations. Whereas the risk in South Asians appears to be really high for heart disease and diabetes. The literature would suggest that for East Asians, the risk is much higher around stroke. So the risks of diabetes in that population are also starting to increase because the rates of obesity are starting to increase even in China and other East Asian populations, but it's not quite where it is in the West or even where it is in South Asia yet. And so the rates of diabetes are not nearly as high as they are in South Asian populations, but the rate of stroke is extremely high. And so there is a very high rate of stroke deaths. And a lot of that we think may be due to the really high salt intake that happens. And as we can see, like Japan, for example, several decades ago, the salt intake in Japan really decreased and their stroke rates really went down. And now the salt intake is starting to increase again and the stroke rates are starting to go up again. So there are clearly variations by population, absolutely.
It's great. It's very interesting. And Jessica or Kathy, I don't know if you can show one of our backup slides, because what I wanted to talk about is, we have other populations that, for example, have virtually no heart disease. And I think it's a good model when we're talking about heart disease. And we know that South Asians have a very high risk of this, to look at the opposite end, look at the opposite extreme, see if we can find a population that has virtually no heart disease and see if we can learn from that. And so I wanted to point out this Chamani population, which is in Bolivia and South America. Genetically, they have a lot of correlations with the people around them in South America and North America. But this was a study that was just published a few years ago. It's a cohort analysis that basically shows that, this population, even though they're in current times, is living essentially in kind of pre-industrial era. There's no machines, there's no washer and dryer, there's no cell phones, there's no computers, there's no grocery stores. They're very active, they're outdoors a lot, they're doing They're sort of in the hunter-gatherer kind of mode. They're fishing. You can see, clothes hanging there. They do their laundry manually. And it was very interesting. They studied this population, and you can see the bar graphs here, where if you look at the natural history of heart disease over time in this population compared to the MESA population, which is a cohort in Europeans and North Americans, that they have virtually no heart disease. And that's measured by something called a calcium score, which we may get to talk about soon. But that's a marker of plaque buildup in your arteries. And even in the elderly population of this cohort, they have virtually no disease. And when they measure their cholesterols of this population, the LDL was below 100 for this group. And so, if you look at a 80-year-old Chimane male, they have the same kind of vascular age as a Caucasian male that's in their 50s. So there's a 30-year difference in that kind of risk. So I think it's interesting. It just kind of points to the fact that, we need to be more active. In our society has kind of regressed into being more sedentary. South Asians in particular tend to be a lot more sedentary than other populations. And if we can be more active and we can get our cholesterol down, you can mitigate risk. So just wanted to show that. Neha, we know that diet and exercise and other healthy lifestyle habits, they're obviously very important. But for a lot of folks, we get this all the time when we see patients in our clinic, even for cardiologists in our own personal lives. It's very hard to maintain healthy habits. So what do you tell your patients, who have a really hard time changing their lifestyle, or, they have changed it a little bit, but they're worried that they can't actually stick to it long term? Are there any tips or tricks? What do you tell your patients?
Yeah. Absolutely, and I do a lot of weight management, and obviously along with kind of medications and so forth, I do a lot of like weight management and exercise and like lifestyle modification in my clinic. And so there are some basic things that I think are helpful no matter where you come from or what your background is. One of the things is actually just sorting through all of the misinformation and misconceptions that are out there. Like, what actually is healthy? What do we know? And, to a large degree, it's confusing because it's confusing. Like, there's a lot of studies coming out that are giving conflicting information. And part of the issue is we just haven't had the degree of rigor in some of these nutritional studies that we really need to have. And so to some degree, some of these things are still unknown. But then when there's all this conflicting information out there, it's hard to know what you should be doing. And so I think a large part of it is actually trying to get the most accurate information about what you actually are aiming for. And so I spent a lot of time talking to folks about that, and especially trying to incorporate any kind of cultural issues that may be present for them. I think specific things that are important are not trying to do everything at once. So I strongly discourage people from like doing some kind of fad diet where they go from whatever their normal diet is to changing everything all at once, and then they suddenly lose a bunch of weight and it seems amazing, and then they're surprised when it comes straight back because it's impossible to keep up. That is not a long-term solution. And so what I talk to people about is, I'm not interested in a diet. I'm interested in kind of lifestyle modification that you're going to sustain over life, because we're in this kind of battle to prevent heart disease for the rest of your life, for however many decades there are to come, and it needs to be something that you can stick with. So I encourage people to actually change one thing at a time. So if I see somebody once a month for weight management, we do one exercise related thing, and they get to choose what that thing is that they're working on, and we do one diet related thing. So if part of what they're doing is they're drinking a lot of sugar sweetened beverages, Coca-Colas and Mountain Dews and whatever else it is, a ton of sugar in your chai, whatever else it is, that's a lot of carbohydrates that you can easily cut out, and that's going to help prevent, diabetes and heart disease. That's one thing. So just do that one thing over the next month. And then let's talk about the next thing, which is the sweets that you eat every night before you go to bed, or so forth. So that's how I talk to people about kind of maintaining lifestyle change over the long term rather than doing things all at once.
That's great. I think that's really good advice. And I'm a big believer in this concept called built environment. And And I'll actually wanted to share a video, Kathy, if we can bring that video up. The idea behind this is to, we'll play the video and then I'll talk about it, but the idea is to change your surroundings, you'll see here, so that you can enable yourself to have better behavior. So I love that video, and I think you know, it's just an example. I think you get the point by looking at it. Is that if you change your surrounding and make exercise or some other habit that you want to do more fun or structured in a way that you have no other choice but to do it, you're more likely to stick to something, and that's the point. And you can do that on a community level. There's a lot of people that are in public policy and health policy and doing community development in neighborhoods and towns, and they're building up, you know, hiking trails and making it clean and making sure there's a lot of restrooms outdoors and a lot of things you can do to renovate. And studies have shown that areas, towns and cities that can do that have a lot more active people and healthier people, and you can stick to it. And there's no reason why you can't do that on a smaller scale in your own house. You know, one easy thing is everybody loves watching their shows that they like to binge on Netflix or other streaming services. And so you could have the only TV in your house that streams, you know, and have an exercise bike or treadmill in front of it, and make a pact with yourself that, you know, when you watch your show, you're going to be exercising at the same time. So those are just kind of like things to change your environment to help make you more healthy.
So that was awesome, Raj. I noticed that we have like 25 questions in the Q&A, and so I wonder if I can go through a few of these. What do you think, Raj?
Yeah, I think we should do that. I do want to leave time to get to those questions. So, you know, we've had a lot of questions here. I'm just looking through the Q&A, and we also had a lot of stuff coming in when people registered. So let's start with kind of diet and exercise. I think we had a lot of questions that came in around this. I'll just read a couple that people had, and they also shared some stories that I think hits really home. So one person asked, you know, there's conflicting information on what diet is right to avoid diabetes. And one school of thought says avoid carbs and sugars, and the other says that the problem is really in the meat that we eat, and it's hard to eat right when you don't know what is right. So in your opinion, kind of what's the best diet to avoid being overweight and risking heart disease and diabetes?
Yeah, probably the most common question that I get, and that's because it is confusing. There's a lot of information out there. From my understanding, my reading of the literature and the data, and I'll try to make this also specific for the South Asian or Asian population. But from my understanding of the data, probably the healthiest diet to help you avoid the development of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, etc., is a diet that is high in healthy fats and lean proteins, such as the Mediterranean diet, which is obviously not the same as a South Asian diet. We can talk about adaptations for a South Asian diet. But a Mediterranean diet is one of the only diets that actually has clear evidence that actually improves heart disease and stroke outcomes. And so what is a Mediterranean diet? A Mediterranean diet is what people in the Mediterranean eat. They did several studies back in the day and noticed that the people in the Mediterranean region happen to be dying less, and they looked at their diets, and it looks like their diet is a large component of that. So what does that mean? So healthy fats include, if you eat fish, salmon, probably one of the single healthiest things you can eat. It has a ton of omega-3 fatty acids, 16 times as much as the next fish down. So seafood in general, but fish specifically, not shellfish. They don't have that much omega-3 fatty acids, but especially fatty fish like salmon. Other things, cooking with extra virgin olive oil. I know that that is not a typical thing in South Asian cooking, to cook with extra virgin olive oil, but I do it myself. It can be done. It's not exactly the same. It's no ghee, but it does taste really good, and it's good for you. Ghee is primarily saturated fat with trans fatty acids. That jazz will kill you. So please don't have ghee all the time. Instead, use extra virgin olive oil. You can cook with it. You can fry with it. It just is a little bit different. It takes some getting used to. But it clearly has polyphenols and other things that we think are antioxidants and anti-inflammatories that are helpful. Having a palm full of nuts, so almonds, walnuts are probably the best studied, that's kind of healthy fats. Lean proteins, so that includes like dals and legumes and things like that. It includes chicken, obviously fish, but chicken, turkey, things like that if you're non-vegetarian. What it does not include is red meat. So red meat is probably not good for you in large quantities. I recommend that my patients have it no more often than once a week max. And that was consistent with the Mediterranean diet as well. Also having kind of moderate, not massive amounts of dairy, but really having high amounts of green leafy vegetables. So the more vegetables you can eat, the healthier you will be. So again, so far we've got healthy fats, healthy proteins, leafy green vegetables as much as possible, whole grains as opposed to kind of simplified, refined carbs. So brown rice is probably better than white rice, things like that. It adds fiber and it has some antioxidant, characteristics that the refined carbohydrates don't have. Now, if you want to avoid diabetes and lower your weight, which is the case for almost every one of us who has grown with wise since high school, right? The important thing there is low carbohydrate. So in and of itself, the Mediterranean diet, what I just described to you, is not a weight loss diet. You could have a whole bunch of carbohydrates and that's still within the Mediterranean diet. But if you want to lose weight, you need to focus on the carbohydrates. So what is that? That is the rice, the roti and naan, chapati, the cereal, pasta, potatoes, and then sweets in general. Those are all carbohydrates. And it's not to say that those are horrible for you, but they're not going to help you lose weight, and they're going to contribute to a higher risk of diabetes. And you can see that in that study that I showed, that the population that had a lot of carbohydrates was the same population developing diabetes. And then we want to avoid blood pressure issues, so not adding a lot of salt. We need to not be adding salt to our diet as much as possible. So in general, what I would recommend is something like a Mediterranean diet that you can kind of make more South Asian or East Asian, Asian in general, if you'd like, low carbohydrate and low salt. I think those are I think that's where there's the most data. People also asked about timing of when they should be eating. In general, we think that it's not great for you to be eating late at night. And I know that's a very common thing in South Asian culture, is to eat dinner really late. And somebody else asked, can I have sweets at night or during the day? In general, we want to be trying to avoid sweets and stuff in general, but the later you eat, the less likely you are to be able to metabolize your food, and it's going to increase your weight. So a lot of people who are trying to lose weight will stop eating at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening and not eat again until the next morning. And so there probably is something to that eating really late at night is probably worse for you. In terms of exercise, several people asked around the different types of exercise, and does aerobic exercise or weights or yoga or things, are they all equal? And I will say that they're not equal. The data is that they're not equal. They're important in different ways. So aerobic exercise, which is where you get your heart rate up, you get moving, and that could be walking. It doesn't have to be going for a jog, but aerobic exercise is really important for protecting your heart. You're exercising your heart muscle when you do that. And so you are protecting your heart, you are decreasing your cholesterol, decreasing your blood pressure, decreasing your sugars, you're going to live longer. All of those things are really important. The non-aerobic exercise, which would be weightlifting, strength training, Pilates, yoga, things like that. They're all good for different reasons. They could be good for the mind and meditation. They're good for strength building. Strength building is important also for kind of increasing your metabolism on the whole. It'll help you to keep weight off that you've already lost, but it's not going to strengthen your heart. It's not going to lower your cholesterol in and of itself. It's not going to help you lose weight in and of itself. Yoga, there are some data that yoga may be helpful moderately in lowering blood pressure and may be helpful in other parameters, but there's very little data around, like, kind of longitudinally around whether or not yoga can actually help prevent heart disease. But I'm fairly certain it cannot hurt. But it just shouldn't be the only type of exercise that you do. You should, if you're going to do yoga, which I think is a great idea, you should also do it with some aerobic exercise. I think that got to like 16 of the questions.
I was going to say, Neha, I'm glad you kept going on a roll.
We're on a timetable here.
Yeah, because we're on a short time. We should have done an hour and a half or 2 hour session here. But I do think, for our audience, almost 80 to 90% of these questions coming in are about diet. So thanks for going through all of that in once, because I think you answered a lot of those questions, particularly about the timing of eating, what to eat, and touched on exercise a little bit. We don't have too much time left, but I know there were, maybe we can do one more question. A lot of people have questions about alcohol and red wine and heart disease. And I know there have been some studies. What is your take on advice around that and heart disease?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, the data around it are confusing. A lot of studies seem to show, again, these are kind of observational studies, right? We're not randomizing people to alcohol or no alcohol, so you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. But a lot of the observational studies seem to indicate that kind of light or moderate alcohol intake might be better for you than no intake, and is definitely, high levels of intake, binge alcohol drinking, every study will tell you that's bad for you. That's just leads to worse outcomes across the board. But there were some studies that showed, quite a few studies that showed that kind of lighter, moderate alcohol intake may look like it's good for you or associated with better outcomes. But then there have been really large, massive studies that were totally conflicting. So another large study came out that was a huge meta-analysis, included millions of people, and it looked like the healthiest amount of alcohol for you was zero alcohol, none at all. And so it's not really clear. And what I tell my patients is this: if you're not drinking alcohol, don't start. Like, by no means does the data suggest that you should do it in order to prevent heart disease. If you're not drinking, great, don't start. If you are drinking, that might be okay, but it shouldn't be a large amount. So what the general recommendation is about, a drink a day or less for women and 2 drinks a day or less for men. That disparity seems a little old-fashioned, but we can talk about that. And so, moderate amounts might be okay. Nobody would recommend more than that. Higher amounts of alcohol intake or binge alcohol drinking are across the board associated with poor outcomes. Red wine, there's been a lot of focus on red wine, especially because red wine is considered to be part of the Mediterranean diet, right? Red wine is, if you look at a traditional Mediterranean diet pyramid, red wine is there in kind of light to moderate consumption. The thought around that has been because it does have some antioxidants. Resveratrol is one of the ones you may have heard of. It does have some antioxidant properties. And so there's been a thought that it may actually be good for you. But there's very little data to suggest that one alcohol is any different from another. And there's nothing to suggest that people, if I weren't drinking alcohol and I started drinking red wine, I'd live longer. There's nothing out there like that. So I think the ultimate message is, if you're not drinking, don't start. If you are drinking, don't have it be too much. Red wine might be better, but might not be any different from the other stuff, and just kind of keep it under moderation.
Great. That's really great. Thanks, Neha. I think we're just about out of time. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. First, thank you so much, Neha, for your time tonight. You gave a wonderful talk. It was nice to pick your brain about some important topics. I also want to just thank our amazing staff who helped coordinate the logistics of this event, Jess, Kathy, the entire Lifelong Learning team. We will have a resource page open afterwards. We'll send that link out, and that could be a place that we can answer some additional questions that have come in that perhaps we couldn't get to tonight, or that you may have afterwards. So now what I want to do is, the last couple of minutes, I want to turn it over to Debbie Cheng. Hi, Debbie. Debbie is a 1999 Fuqua grad and is the vice chair of programming at DAAA. And she's going to give us some closing remarks and talk about some exciting future events that we're planning. So bring it home for us, Debbie.
Thanks, Raj. Again, I'm Debbie Chang, Vice Chair Programming for DAAA. On behalf of our nearly 22,000 Duke Asian alums around the world, I would like to thank Dr. Neha Pagidipati for a very informative presentation. I would also like to give a big shout out to Raj and Men, our Triangle co-chairs, for putting this together, Jess and Kathy from Duke's Alumni Affairs Office for helping us to coordinate all the logistics for the event. Last but not least, thank you all for being here despite the Duke-Syracuse game going on right now. We appreciate you. Before we close out our program, I would like to give a brief plug for DAAA. Our vision, as you know, is to facilitate connections through meaningful programs, as well as to engage in rich conversations around issues affecting this extensive and diverse group of alumni. With that in mind, we have a couple upcoming programs that are listed on your screen. First, we have Breaking into Hollywood in collaboration with Demon on April 7th, Forever Learning Institute program on April 13th, and our global symposium, The Path to Success, on May 21st. Please check your emails for registration information. If you would like more information on how to become involved in DAAA, please feel free to email me. My email address is in the chat, or follow DAAA on social media. Thank you again for spending the last hour with us. Go Blue Devils. Good night.